Hi, Prodigal Teens. Pastor Chris here. Today is Thursday in our devotional series, and today we're going to look at our continued passage that we looked at yesterday, and we're going to talk about Thomas. So, before we jump into it, though, one of the things everybody likes to assume about the resurrection of Jesus is that Jesus appeared to everybody all at once on Sunday night. That everybody was there. Everybody heard about Jesus appearing. And it was just kind of a thing. But as we're going to read in this passage, Thomas was missing from the initial appearance of Jesus to the 10 disciples. And now Jesus is actually going to show up about a week later to Thomas, which is kind of interesting that we don't consider the resurrection kind of happening over several weeks. We consider it happening just all on Sunday. But by this account, Jesus continues appearing to the disciples long after he rises from the dead. So let's read our passage here. I'm in John 20, starting in verse 24. If you've got a Bible, grab it, follow along with me, and let's look at it. Now Thomas, also called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my fingers where his nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your fingers here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said, "My Lord, my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed." Okay. So that's our little passage for today. So the first thing to notice about Thomas, and this is not Thomas's first appearance in the Gospels. Thomas has made 3 or 4 pop-ups in the Gospel, and he's where we get the idea of a doubting Thomas from, or the idiom, a doubting Thomas, because every time he shows up in the Gospels, Jesus says he's going to do something, and Thomas goes, "You're not going to do that. That's scientifically impossible. I don't believe that you can do it. You're crazy, Jesus." Then Jesus does it, and Thomas is proven wrong, okay? And so here, this keeps very much in line with the character of Thomas. Thomas wants proof that what people say is going to happen, right? So when the disciples come to him and say, "We've seen Jesus. Jesus is alive," he says, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my fingers where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Okay? Thomas not only wants to see Jesus alive, but he wants to literally stick his fingers in the nail holes to make sure it's actually Jesus. Actually the Jesus that he saw die, because he saw it with his own eyes. He saw Jesus die on that cross. And then, so he's not going to believe it's Jesus unless there are nail marks, unless his side is pierced, because he saw the horrific way that Jesus died. And honestly, I can't fault Thomas too much, because this is a pretty natural response to what just happened, right? Thomas just watched one of his best friends in the whole wide world, the guy that he'd given up his life to follow for the last 3 years, die a horrid death on a Roman torture device. So of course he's not going to believe that he's alive. That's impossible. Physically, scientifically, there is no way that Jesus could possibly raise himself from the dead, even to a first-century Jewish mind. And yet Thomas is going to actually end up believing by the end of this passage. Now, it's worth noting here, because this passage is not the only passage that calls Thomas this. It calls Thomas, also known as Didymus. Lots of the disciples had 2 names, sometimes for various reasons, but Thomas's is interesting. Thomas is an Aramaic version of the Greek name Didymus, okay? Both of those names mean the same thing. They both mean twin. You see down at the bottom of my page there's a footnote that's entitled A. It says Thomas Aramaic and Didymus Greek, both mean twin. So Thomas and Didymus are actually the same name. They're just variants of it. For instance, my middle name is Mateo. It's Spanish, but that's just Spanish for Matthew. Matthew and Mateo are the same names. There's no distinction with them other than language. And so it's the same here with Thomas. Now, it's interesting that they call that Thomas's name is this, because typically in first century Judea, you named your kids based off of what you believed about them, right? So many have speculated, and it's pretty likely that Thomas has a twin somewhere, and we just don't ever see him. He's not one of the disciples of Jesus. He doesn't seem to come along for the ride, or at least he's not a known disciple of Jesus. Jesus had well over 72 disciples, as we find out later on in Luke. But Thomas must have had a twin somewhere, a twin brother that he left behind, along with the rest of his family too, because this is just what the demand of Jesus was, that if you're going to follow me, you're going to leave your family behind unless they come too. And so Thomas is just kind of an interesting character. I really wish we had more of him in the gospel narrative. And he's really interesting because most scholars believe that Thomas ended up going over and helping start the church in India, or what is modern-day India. So he's just got a really interesting life. But back to our narrative. So Jesus shows up, and he says that thing that we talked about last time, right? Peace be with you. He says it again. He wants the disciples to know that they need to have peace. And it's interesting, too, because it says that this is a week after Jesus showed up, gave them the power of the Holy Spirit, right? And told them to go out and start doing stuff. And what are they found doing a week later? They're found locked inside the house again. It specifically says the doors are locked this time, right? The disciples, they're still living in fear, even though Jesus said, don't live in fear, go do stuff, right? They're not doing what Jesus commanded them to do. So they're hiding out in the house, and this time Thomas happens to be with them. Jesus pops up, stands among them, says, peace be with you, and then he looks dead at Thomas as if he's extremely sassy and says, put your fingers here, see my hands, reach your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. And what does Thomas do? Does he walk up to Jesus and put his fingers into the nail hole and his hand into the side hole? No. Instead, he just falls down and says, my Lord, my God. He affirms that this is Jesus Christ, his best friend, the guy he's been traveling with for 3 years, without the need for the physical proof that he said he needed of putting his fingers into the side. Now, granted, if Jesus just evaporated in front of me, I probably would do the same thing. I wouldn't need the confirmation of sticking my hand into his side. But it's interesting that Thomas doesn't need all of the physical proof he demanded before. Jesus leaves us with this last line, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Of course, Jesus is referring to us in this instance, to all the Christians who are going to come after, who don't get to physically see Jesus, right? The disciples are blessed. They got to spend 3 years with Jesus. That is a blessing. But yet Jesus seems to put an even better blessing on those who have not seen him and yet believed, because we don't get the physical proof that the disciples got. We have to live by faith until our death, when we get to see Jesus face to face. So take a lesson from Thomas. It's not bad to be a doubter. It's not bad to ask questions. But when you're confronted face to face with Jesus, believe in the evidence that's before you. I hope you're well. I look forward to seeing you next time. I look forward to seeing you when this quarantine is all over. Until then, sayonara.